Story 1. The Vanishing Truck. I've been driving this godforsaken stretch of highway for hours. My body is begging for sleep, but my delivery deadline isn't going to move just because I'm tired. The highway is so empty it feels like I'm the only person alive in the world. No cars, no streetlights, just the dull hum of my truck's engine and the hypnotic blur of dashed white lines flicking past me. That's when I see it, a semi-truck up ahead. An old, rusted beast of a thing with a grimy trailer that's swaying slightly, like it's struggling to stay in its lane. But the thing is, I could swear it wasn't there a second ago. I didn't see it come up over the horizon, didn't catch a hint of headlights in my mirrors. One blink, and there it is hulking in front of me like it's been waiting. The truck's rear lights are dim, flickering like dying embers, and there's no company logo on the back. No license plate either. Just rust and grime and a thick streak of something black, oily, and dripping. I frown, easing off the gas. This stretch of highway isn't exactly known for its roadside services, but even here, a truck like that shouldn't be out on the road. The semi seems to slow down even more, as if it's taunting me. I sigh, grip the wheel tighter, and decide to pass it. I ease into the left lane, pressing the gas as I come alongside the cab. I glance over, curious to see who's driving this relic. But when I look, there's no driver. I freeze, my stomach flipping as my brain tries to make sense of what I just saw or didn't see. The cab is empty. Just an old, ripped seat and a filthy dashboard. But the engine's running, and the truck's moving steadily. I grip the wheel harder, accelerate, and pass it. My pulse pounds in my ears, and for a brief moment, I feel a sick sort of relief when it's behind me. But then I glance in the rearview mirror. It's still there. Worse, it's closer. The semi's headlights pulse, not like a normal flicker, but rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. I keep watching the mirror, and for a second, I swear I see something in the truck's cab. A shadow, dark and hunched over, just barely visible against the gloom. I try to shake it off. My brain's just fried. Long shifts and lonely roads can do weird things to you. I turn on the radio to drown out the silence, flipping through static until I find a faint station playing something upbeat. It helps a little, until the truck honks. I nearly jump out of my skin. The horn isn't normal. It's shrill, jagged, like metal scraping against metal. It's not even a sound so much as a scream. I glance in the mirror again, and now the truck's practically riding my bumper, its headlights blinding me even through the dim glow of my own cab. Okay, screw this. I mutter, adrenaline kicking in. I slam on the gas, the engine of my delivery van roaring as I try to put distance between me and the semi. It doesn't work. No matter how fast I go, the truck stays right behind me. And then, out of nowhere, its headlights shut off. It disappears into the darkness. A blink, my heart hammering. Did it turn off the road? Did I imagine the whole thing? I slow down just a bit. The headlights flick on again, but this time, they're directly beside me. I whip my head to the left and see the truck pulling up alongside me, so close I can make out every dent, every smear of rust on its monstrous frame. The windows of the cab are black, and for one horrifying moment, I see my own face staring back at me in the glass, expressionless, blank-eyed. What the hell? The truck swerves sharply, forcing me off the road. My van skids into the ditch, jarring me so hard my head slams against the steering wheel. Dazed, I sit there gripping the wheel as my chest heaves. The semi-truck comes to a stop on the shoulder, just ahead of me. Its hazard lights blink on, slow and deliberate, casting eerie flashes over the surrounding scrubland. I don't know what I'm thinking, but I get out of my van. My legs are shaking as I stumble toward the truck. The air smells thick and acrid, like burning rubber mixed with something metallic. When I reach the cab, the door is slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. My pulse is so loud it drowns out every other sound. Slowly, I pull the door open. The cab is empty, but the engine's still running. And that smell, Jesus, that smell. It makes my eyes water, my throat burn. I back away, shaking my head. No driver, no explanation. Just this monstrous machine sitting there like it's waiting for me to do something. I turn back toward my van, desperate to get out of here. But when I climb inside and turn the key, nothing happens. Not even a click. The battery's dead. Come on, come on. I whisper, my voice cracking. That's when the radio crackles to life. It's static at first, but then I hear it. Faint, distorted words breaking through the noise. A voice. My voice. You shouldn't have stopped, it says, barely audible but unmistakable. My blood turns to ice. I yank the keys out of the ignition and scramble out of the van, waving my arms at the first set of headlights I see in the distance. Another car slows down, a pickup truck. The driver, an older man with a kind face, rolls down his window. You okay, son? Need a ride? I nod, muttering something about car trouble. He gestures for me to hop in, and I don't hesitate. I just need to get away from this place. The pickup pulls back onto the highway, and I exhale for what feels like the first time in hours. Relief washes over me, until I glance at the dashboard. It's not a pickup truck at all. It's the semi. The interior is identical, down to the ripped seat and the filthy dashboard. And in the driver's seat isn't the old man. It's me. I'm staring at myself, my face pale and lifeless, my eyes black as oil. My doppelganger grins, his teeth unnaturally sharp. You're finally here, he says, his voice echoing in my skull. I don't even have time to scream before everything goes dark. Story 2. The woman on the shoulder. I shouldn't have stopped. It was 3 a.m., and the highway was a black ribbon stretching endlessly into the void. I just finished a brutal double shift at the warehouse, my eyes heavy, my hands aching from hours of lifting boxes. I should have been focused on getting home to collapse in bed. But then I saw her. She was walking along the shoulder, barefoot, in a torn white dress that fluttered slightly in the breeze. Her long, dark hair hung limp, and she looked lost, vulnerable, out of place in every possible way. My first instinct was to drive past her. After all, I'd seen enough horror movies to know better. But something about her stopped me. She looked so small out there, so fragile. And the highway was completely deserted. No other cars for miles. What if something happened to her? What if something already had? Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. My truck's headlights illuminated her as she turned toward me. Her face was strange, not in an obvious, horrifying way, but in the kind of way that made me uneasy without knowing why. Her features seemed slightly off. Her eyes were just a little too big, her smile too small. She didn't look scared or surprised to see me, just resigned, like she'd been expecting me. Do you need a ride? I asked through the open passenger window. For a moment, she didn't respond. She just stared at me, her head tilted slightly to the side. Then, without a word, she nodded and opened the door. The inside of my truck suddenly felt smaller as she climbed in. She sat stiffly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her feet bare and filthy against the floor mat. Where are you headed? I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Anywhere but here, she said. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a strange weight. All right, I said, glancing over at her. She was staring out the window, her face unreadable. You okay? You look like you've been through a lot. She didn't answer. The silence between us stretched out, heavy and awkward. I turned on the radio to break the tension, but all I got was static. My fingers fumbled with the dials, but no matter what I did, I couldn't find a single station. Do you believe in second chances? She asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the static like a knife. What? You glanced her, startled. Second chances, she repeated, still staring out the window. Do you believe in them? I guess you still med. Sure, why not? She turned to look at me then, and her eyes seemed even larger than before, too shiny, like glass. What would you do if you could rewrite one mistake? I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the wheel. I don't know. I guess it depends on the mistake. She hummed softly, a haunting little tune that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Do you have regrets? She asked. Doesn't everyone? I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled then, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the kind of smile that made my stomach twist in knots, like she knew something I didn't. The highway seemed to stretch on forever. My GPS, which had been faithfully guiding me home, suddenly froze. The little arrow on the screen stopped moving, and the map blinked out, replaced by a gray void. "What the hell?" I muttered, tapping the screen. It didn't respond. The road ahead was no longer familiar. It wasn't even paved anymore, just an unmarked gravel path lined with dense, looming trees that seemed to crowd closer and closer the farther we drove. "I think we're lost," I said, glancing at her. She was still staring out the window, humming that eerie little tune. "We're not lost," she said. "Look, if you've got somewhere specific you need to go, just tell me. Otherwise, I'm turning around and heading back." Her laugh was sudden and sharp, like glass breaking. It sent a cold shiver down my spine. "You can't go back," she said. "What's that supposed to mean?" I snapped, my frustration outweighing my unease. She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against the window, her breath fogging up the glass. "Stop the car," she said suddenly. "What? Why?" "Stop the car," she screamed, her voice so loud and shrill that it made my ears ring. Panic surged through me, and I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. Before I could say anything, she flung the door open and bolted into the darkness. "Wait!" I shouted, but she was already gone, swallowed by the shadows. I sat there, my heart hammering in my chest. Part of me wanted to follow her, to make sure she was okay. But a stronger part of me, the part that was screaming at me to leave, won out. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, shaking my head. I slammed the door shut, threw the truck in a drive, and peeled out of there. Relief washed over me as I put distance between myself and whatever the hell just happened. The gravel path eventually gave way to smooth asphalt, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her running after me. She wasn't, but she was sitting in the back seat. My blood turned to ice. She wasn't the same as before. Her face was twisted and warped, her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, her eyes black and empty. "You should have kept driving," she hissed, her voice low and guttural. Before I could react, she lunged forward, her cold, bony hands grabbing at my neck. The last thing I heard was her laughter, echoing in the dark. Story 3. The wrong exit. It's funny, the things you notice when you're dead tired. The flickering light of a gas station. The distant glow of headlights that never seem to catch up. The fact that the GPS wants you to take exit 17, an exit you're pretty damn sure doesn't exist during the day. I was heading back home after a road trip. It was just me, my beat-up sedan, and a playlist of old songs I barely liked. The clock on the dashboard said 2:43 a.m., and I still had 2 hours to go. When the GPS chimed in with that soft, automated voice, "Take the next exit, exit 17, I frowned. I'd driven this highway plenty of times. There was no exit 17, at least, not during the day. The thought sent a little shiver through me, but exhaustion won out over paranoia. Maybe it was a new off-ramp I hadn't noticed before. Maybe I just needed to stop overthinking and trust the tech. So I took the exit. The road dipped sharply, curving so tightly that I had to grip the wheel with both hands. The further I went, the more it felt like I was descending into something. Not just leaving the highway, but leaving something else. It's hard to explain. The off-ramp went on longer than it should have. A long, spiraling slope that felt endless. My headlights barely illuminated the cracked pavement ahead, and the guardrails on either side were bent and rusted, like they'd been there for decades. Finally, the road leveled out, and I emerged onto a narrow, two-lane road. The forest on either side was thick, the trees so close they leaned over the asphalt, their branches forming an archway that blocked out the moonlight. There were no signs, no markers, no cars. My phone buzzed, and I glanced down to see no service plastered across the screen. Of course, this doesn't feel right, I muttered to myself, but turning back wasn't an option. There hadn't been a single spot wide enough to make a U-turn, and the road was so narrow, I'd end up in the ditch if I tried. I kept driving, figuring the road would loop back to the highway eventually. But it didn't. After about 10 minutes, I came across something that made me slow to a crawl. a car sitting in the middle of the road. Its hazard lights were flashing, casting an orange glow that bounced off the surrounding trees. I pulled up alongside it, rolling down my window. "Hey, you okay?" No answer. The car doors were open, both driver and passenger sides, but there was no sign of anyone. Just an empty vehicle, its engine dead, and its hazard lights blinking like a heartbeat. I should have kept driving, but something about the scene made me stop and get out. My shoes crunched against the gravel shoulder as I approached. The inside of the car was wrong. The seats were soaked, but not with water. It was something thicker, darker. The steering wheel was bent at an odd angle, and the dashboard had deep gouges in it, like someone had dragged claws across the plastic. The smell hit me then, coppery and metallic like blood. My stomach churned. "Nope," I muttered, backing away and practically sprinting back to my car. I jumped in, slammed the door, and locked it. Whatever had happened here wasn't my problem. I kept driving, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The further I went, the stranger things became. I passed a line of mailboxes along the side of the road, but there weren't any houses. Just mailboxes, evenly spaced, stretching into the trees. A few minutes later, I spotted something else ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, my heart pounding. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His face was obscured by shadows, and he was standing completely still, his arms hanging limply at his sides. I honked the horn. "Hey, move!" He didn't budge. I honked again, louder this time, but he didn't react. Something about the way he stood sent chills through me. It wasn't just stillness, it was the wrong kind of stillness. No rise and fall of breath. No subtle shifts of weight. Just frozen like a mannequin planted in the middle of the road. Screw this. I wasn't sticking around to find out what his deal was. I swerved to go around him, but my tires skidded on the loose gravel at the edge of the road. The car lurched, tipping into the ditch, and I slammed to a stop. "Shit!" I shouted, gripping the wheel as the engine sputtered. I looked up. The man was gone. I sat there for a moment, trying to collect myself. Then I heard it, a sound like twigs snapping. Soft at first, but getting closer. I glanced out the window and nearly screamed. The man wasn't a man, not even close. He was impossibly tall, his limbs too long and thin, his skin pale and almost translucent, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his face, God, his face was wrong, smooth and blank, except for a wide, lipless grin that seemed to stretch from ear to ear. He started to move toward me, his limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. I scrambled for the ignition, twisting the key until the engine roared back to life. Throwing the car into reverse, I slammed on the gas, speeding backward down the road. But the road wasn't the same anymore. The trees were closer now, their branches clawing at the sides of the car. The mailboxes I'd passed earlier were gone, replaced by jagged wooden posts. And then I saw it, a dead end. The road just stopped, ending in a wall of trees. No, I muttered, slamming the brakes. I glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping for some miracle. Instead, I saw him. The thing was sitting calmly in the passenger seat, its head tilted toward me, its grin even wider now. "You're finally here," it whispered. The last thing I saw was its hand reaching for me. Story 4. Lights in the sky. The first time I saw the strange lights hovering over the highway, I thought they were just stars. I was wrong. It was close to midnight, and I was driving down an empty stretch of desert highway, the kind of road that makes you feel like you're on the edge of the world. It was just me, the dark expanse of sand on either side, and the faint hum of my car's engine. No other cars, no gas stations, no signs of life, period. The sky was pitch black, peppered with stars, so bright they looked like they could drop out of the sky. I noticed the lights just above the horizon, faint at first, like a cluster of stars that seemed to pulse in unison. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was probably a plane or a satellite or some military test out in the desert. But as I kept driving, I noticed something strange. The lights weren't stationary. They moved, not like an airplane or a shooting star, but in sharp, erratic patterns. They zigzagged, stopped suddenly, then shot across the sky at impossible speeds before slowing down again. My eyes kept darting back to them in the rearview mirror, and no matter how far I drove, they seemed to stay the same distance behind me. Drones, I muttered to myself, trying to calm the unease bubbling in my chest. That's all they were. Just drones. Somebody testing out some fancy new tech in the middle of nowhere. Nothing to worry about. But the longer I watched them, the harder it became to convince myself of that. After a while, I turned my attention back to the road, trying to ignore the lights. That's when the radio crackled to life. I hadn't touched it. It had been off the entire drive. At first, it was just static, but then I started to hear something buried beneath the noise. A voice, speaking in a language I didn't understand. It was low and guttural, the words drawn out like someone was whispering underwater. What the hell? I turned the radio off. It clicked back on by itself. The voice grew louder, overlapping with itself like it wasn't one person speaking, but many, all saying the same alien words in perfect unison. I slammed the dial, but it didn't help. That's when my headlights flickered. The beam in front of me stuttered, plunging the road into darkness before sputtering back to life. Then the car jolted, and I felt it begin to slow down. My foot was pressed firmly on the gas, but the engine started to whine, the speedometer dropping steadily. No. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the wheel, pressing the gas pedal as hard as I could. The car slowed to a crawl. I glanced up at the lights in the sky. They were brighter now, no longer faint pinpricks but full-on orbs, glowing with an unnatural blue-white light. They moved lower, closer, their erratic patterns becoming more deliberate. They were following me. Panic set in. I yanked the wheel and pulled the car over to the side of the road, throwing it into park. The lights descended, hovering directly above me now. They bathed the entire highway in a cold, sterile glow, so bright it made the sand on the side of the road glisten like glass. The air around me felt different, heavier, colder. I don't know why I got out of the car. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe I thought I could reason with whatever was causing this. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't real. I stepped out into the light, the cold air stinging my skin. The sound of the wind seemed to vanish completely, replaced by a low hum that rattled in my chest. That's when I saw them. At the edge of the light, just where the glow faded into darkness, figures began to appear. They were humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, their thin, elongated limbs twitching as they moved toward me. Their motions were jerky, like they were being pulled along by invisible strings. Their skin, or whatever it was smooth and reflective, catching the light and refracting it in strange, distorted patterns. I backed up, stumbling against the car. My breath came in short, sharp bursts clouding in the freezing air. They didn't have faces. Their heads were featureless, blank ovals that tilted unnaturally as if they were studying me. One of them stepped forward, its head twitching slightly to one side. I froze, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It raised one long, spindly arm, reaching toward me. Its hand, or what passed for a hand, was split into impossibly long fingers, jointed in too many places. I snapped out of my paralysis and dove back into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The figure stopped, standing just outside the light of the car. The lights in the sky blinked out all at once, plunging everything into darkness. The sudden silence was deafening. I sat there, chest heaving, staring out into the void, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the road was empty. No lights, no figures, nothing. After a long moment, I started the car. The engine sputtered, but it turned over. I didn't think, I just drove. The road stretched on forever, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. Relief washed over me as the highway came back into view, its wide lanes illuminated by the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. I turned the radio on, hoping for some music to calm my nerves. Instead, I heard my own voice. It was faint at first, then louder. "Help me," it said, distorted and frantic. "Oh God, help me, please." My voice cut out, replaced by static. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The lights were back. This time, they weren't hovering in the sky. They were right behind me. Story 5. The Hitchhiker in the Fog. There's an urban legend about a hitchhiker who only appears when the fog rolls in on Route 66. They say if you stop for him, you'll never make it home. I never believed it, just another ghost story truckers tell to pass the time. But now, I wish I had listened. It was past midnight, and I was driving the loneliest stretch of Route 66 I'd ever seen. The fog rolled in out of nowhere, thick and suffocating, turning the world into a gray void. My headlights barely cut through it, illuminating just a few feet of cracked asphalt ahead. The glow of the moon was gone, swallowed by the mist. I tightened my grip on the wheel and kept going, but the eerie silence was getting to me. No crickets, no wind, just the low hum of my car's engine. That's when I saw him. At first, he was just a shadowy figure standing on the shoulder of the road, his thumbs sticking out. He was barely visible in the fog, but as I got closer, the details came into focus. A young man, maybe in his early 20s, wearing tattered jeans and a ratty hoodie. His hair was matted, and he looked cold, shivering in the damp air. The urban legend popped into my head, uninvited. Don't stop. Don't stop. But what if he really needed help? He looked so pitiful, standing there in the middle of nowhere, miles from anything. I cursed under my breath and pulled over, my tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. He didn't move right away, just stood there for a moment, staring at my car. Then, slowly, he walked over and opened the passenger door. Need a ride? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded and climbed in without a word. Up close, he looked even worse. His clothes were filthy, his hands scratched up like he'd been crawling through brambles. His eyes were the worst. They were blank, lifeless, like he wasn't really there. Where are you headed? I asked as I pulled back onto the highway. I need to get back, he muttered, his voice low and hoarse. Back where? They're waiting. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced over at him, hoping for some kind of explanation, but he just stared straight ahead, unblinking. The fog grew thicker, so dense it felt like I was driving through a cloud. My headlights barely penetrated it now, and the trees on either side of the road were just dark smudges in the mist. Something felt off. The car's clock, a cheap little digital display on the dashboard, started acting weird. The numbers blinked and flickered before spinning backward. Midnight. 11:30. 11. What the hell? I muttered, tapping the glass. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the hitchhiker turn his head slightly, just enough to look at me. His lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. The gas gauge started flickering next. First full, then empty, then full again. I tried to focus on the road, but the eerie silence was getting to me. Then he started humming. It was a soft, haunting tune, a lullaby that made my eyelids feel heavier with every note. The melody was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It made my head swim, like I was drifting into a dream. Hey, I said, forcing myself to speak. What are you humming? He didn't answer. Look, I'm glad to give you a ride, but I need some answers, I said, louder this time, trying to snap myself out of the fog, both literally and figuratively. Still nothing. Where the hell are you trying to go? I demanded, my voice sharp now. That's when he moved. Faster than I thought possible, his hand shot out and grabbed the steering wheel. His fingers were ice cold, and his grip was unnaturally strong. Hey, what are you doing? I shouted, trying to wrestle the wheel back. He didn't say a word, just yanked the wheel hard to the right. The car veered off the road, the tires skidding on loose gravel before hitting soft earth. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car slid into a shallow ditch and came to a jarring stop. The last thing I remember was the sound of the impact, the dull thud of my head hitting the steering wheel, and the faint sound of his humming as everything went black. When I woke up, everything was normal. The car was back on the road, perfectly fine. No dents, no scratches, no sign that I'd just crashed. The fog had lifted, and the sky above was a pale, pre-dawn gray. I looked over to the passenger seat. The hitchhiker was gone. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I'd been more tired than I realized, and my brain had cooked up some kind of hallucination. I shook my head, started the car, and pulled back onto the highway. The drive was uneventful after that. Peaceful even, no full, no weird humming. Just the open road and the faint glow of the sunrise on the horizon. But then, just as I was starting to feel like myself again, I heard it. A whisper. It came from directly behind me, soft and cold, brushing against the back of my neck like a breath. You shouldn't have stopped. My heart leapt into my throat. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was there, sitting in the back seat, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his grin wide and wrong. I screamed and swerved, the car veering wildly off the road. The last thing I saw before everything went black again was his face, staring at me through the shattered windshield. When I woke up this time, the car was a wreck, my body aching from the impact. And there he was standing on the side of the road, his thumb sticking out, waiting. Just like before, waiting for me to pick him up. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.